The day after she and her husband arrived in Nauvoo in early February 1842, Joseph Smith visited Mary Elizabeth Rawlins Lightner with Brigham Young and proposed marriage to her in a most unusual way. As she recalled, "Brother Joseph told me that the angel had appeared to him 3 times, the last time with a drawn sword, commanding him to take me as his wife. He told me in 1834 he saw me standing by his side while preaching in Kirtland, Ohio. I was 1,000 miles away from him at that time. The angel appeared to him and told him what it meant, but he became afraid and did not dare to write me. But after 7 years, the angel appeared the 3rd time and threatened his life, unless he done what the angel, told him." Mary was naturally skeptical and wondered why Smith waited so long to tell her, but he assured her that she would receive a testimony that the principle of plural marriage was true. She said an angel appeared to her one night, but she was so afraid she couldn't speak, but neither did the angel. Nevertheless, she believed it was a sign, and that her prayers had been answered. When Smith married Mary Elizabeth later that same month, she had been married to non-Mormon Adam Lightner since 1835 and was 8 months pregnant. Hi, I'm Dan Vogel. Welcome back. In this video, I continue my analysis of Brian C. Hales' evidence for eternity-only marriage, and I will discuss the particular circumstances of most of Joseph Smith's polyandrous wives, focusing especially on evidence of sexuality. I begin with an examination of the first 4 women on Hales' chart, who he claims were definitely eternity-only sealings. I will pass over Sarah Kingsley since Hales has no evidence to support his claim and is motivated to classify her as eternity-only purely on the basis that she was married to non-Mormon John Cleveland, who would be unlikely to relinquish his wife to Smith. Hales' key evidence for eternity-only sealings among Joseph Smith's wives comes from his discovery among Andrew Jensen's papers of a biographical sketch of Ruth Vos Sayres, which describes the unique circumstances of Sayres' marriage to Smith, a portion of which reads, "Mr. Sayres, not attaching much importance to the theory of a future life, insisted that his wife Ruth should be sealed to the prophet for eternity, as he himself should only claim her in this life. She was accordingly sealed to the prophet in Emma Smith's presence, and thus became numbered among the prophet's plural wives, though she continued to live with Mr. Sayres until his death." It is unknown where Jensen obtained this information, but it was apparently after Ruth died on the 18th of August, 1884. Jensen's sketch includes a clipping from Ruth's obituary that appeared in the Women's Exponent on the 15th of September, 1884, and it is written on the backs of discarded proof sheets of his article on Joseph Smith's polygamy, which appeared in the May 1887 issue of the Historical Record, actually printed in July. Hales believes that Jensen's sketch of Sayres was written in 1887, as he was interviewing an unidentified Nauvoo polygamist, but it was likely Eliza R. Snow or Melissa Lott. Both of these former wives of Joseph Smith helped Jensen compile a list of Joseph Smith's plural wives. However, Ruth's name appears in Snow's handwriting, following Lott's contribution to Jensen's list of names. Hales observed that this list was used to write his article that appeared in the Historical Record in May 1887, and that he wrote it the previous February. Hales states, "While collecting data for his article, Andrew Jensen asked Eliza R. Snow, then age 83, to provide information regarding all of Joseph Smith's plural wives. Apparently, during his interview, Andrew turned the list he had constructed to that point over to the delicate octogenarian, and she added 13 names on the list. Significantly, the second name she added was that of Ruth Vos Sayres. However, it is doubtful that either Snow or Lott supplied Jensen with the information in his biographical sketch. Lott evidently did not know about Ruth Sayres, and Snow was probably dead when Jensen wrote his sketch. Regardless, an examination of Jensen's 1887 publication shows that his biographical sketches can't be trusted. In his list of 27 wives of Joseph Smith, 9 were polyandrous marriages, yet 5 were referred to by their maiden names, and he systematically excluded mention of first husbands and gave no hint that some of them had been married polyandrously. Hales tries to interpret the silence about polyandry in the list and accompanying affidavits as consistent with an interpretation that sexual polyandry was not practiced by Nauvoo polygamists, and therefore they felt no need to defend or hide it in their later recollections. However, it is more likely the silence is due to his wish to avoid controversy, since the suppression is too complete and systematic to be the result of an unconcern or indifference. For example, his listing for Zina D. Huntington, who was married to Henry Jacobs and pregnant at the time she married Joseph Smith, reads, Zina D. Huntington, afterwards the wife of President Brigham Young, sealed to the prophet October 27, 1841, Dimmick B. Huntington officiating. Her sister Fanny was present as a witness. See sketch, page blank. 6 of the 27 wives included page numbers for biographical sketches, which had been provided up to and including the July 1887 issue. And he evidently intended to provide the others in future issues, but never did, although he had several years to do so. The following month, Jensen received a letter from Wilford Woodruff, church historian and president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, which may have influenced his decision to discontinue his project. We do not think it a wise step to give these names to the world at present time, in the manner which you have done in this historical record. Advantage may be taken of their publication, and in some instances, to the injury, perhaps, of families or relatives of those whose names are mentioned. Obviously, a church openly practicing polygamy wouldn't be embarrassed or worried about Joseph Smith's polygamous wives. It might even be considered an honor. Moreover, Joseph F. Smith had already published many of his polygamy documents in the Deseret News in 1879 and 1886, which had named 13 women as wives of Joseph Smith. More likely, Woodruff and the other authorities were concerned about polyandry and what Jensen's forthcoming biographies might reveal, or what the critics might discover on their own, which is another clue that these marriages were not innocent, non-sexual eternity-only sealings. Yet, Jensen had been careful to conceal polyandry with inaccurate, incomplete, or misleading information. For Elvira A. Cowles, for example, who had married Jonathan H. Holmes 5 months before she married Joseph Smith, he wrote, Elvira A. Cowles, afterwards the wife of Jonathan H. Holmes. See sketch, page blank. For Ruth Vos Sayers, he gave a more ambiguous description. Ruth D. Vos, known as the wife of Edward Sayers. See sketch, page blank. Hales thinks that the wording could support a polyandrous interpretation that was apparently not then viewed as problematic. He is apparently unaware that Jensen later corrected that possibility in the December 1889 issue, when he published an index that included the following brief biographical sketch of Ruth under the letter V. Vos, Ruth D., a wife of Joseph Smith the prophet, was a daughter of Mark and Sally Vos, born at Watertown, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, February 26, 1808. Died in Salt Lake City, Utah, August 18, 1884. After the death of the prophet, she married Edward Sayers. It is difficult to reconcile this statement with what Jensen wrote in his unpublished biographical sketch. Either he intentionally suppressed polyandry, in which case his account can't be trusted, or the sketch about Ruth Vos dates to after 1889, long after Eliza R. Snow had died on the 5th of December, 1887, and therefore the source is of unknown authority. The 1889 index contains another similarly suspicious addition. Harris, Lucinda, was one of the first plural wives sealed to the prophet Joseph. She was afterwards married to George W. Harris. On the contrary, Lucinda had been married to George W. Harris since 1830. Hales' use of Jensen's biographical sketch of Ruth Vos Serres to establish the existence of eternity-only sealings among Joseph Smith's wives is therefore problematic for the following reasons. Jensen's claim that it was Edward Serres who suggested to Joseph Smith that he marry his wife for eternity stands alone and is uncorroborated. It contradicts what Jensen wrote in the historical record as late as December 1889. The authority upon which the account rests is unknown. The claim that Emma Smith was present, a favorite Utah Jeb at the RLDS, raises questions about the source of information, since in her 1869 affidavit for Joseph F. Smith, Ruth did not mention Emma's presence, but left a blank following the words "in the presence of," suggesting she could not then remember who was present. Evidence of Jensen's systematic suppression of polyandry makes any unattributed or uncorroborated statement coming from him on this topic suspicious. Despite these issues, Hales attempts to use the unusual case of Ruth and Edward Serres to argue that at least 4 other polyandrous wives of Joseph Smith were also eternity-only sealings, and that 6 other less documented cases were probably eternity-only sealings. But this exceptional case cannot be used for situations that were nothing like it. Rather, the model for these less documented cases should be that of Sylvia and Windsor Lyon, as discussed in the previous video. Hales categorizes Ruth Vos Serres as definitely an eternity-only sealing. However, because of the historical issues that accompany Jensen's unpublished biographical sketch, with serious reservations, I list it as possibly an eternity-only marriage. After Ruth Vos Serres, Hales names Esther Dutcher as the second example of an eternity-only sealing among Joseph Smith's plural marriages. But it is hardly that, since the source he uses strongly implies just the opposite. Indeed, it is hard to imagine why Hales would name Esther Dutcher as his second-best example of eternity-only sealing, although he is motivated to do so because Esther conceived her son, Joseph Albert Smith, about December 1843, and that would imply polyandry if Joseph Smith was also having sex with her. Esther Dutcher married Albert Smith, no relation to Joseph Smith, in 1826, and both were converted to Mormonism in 1837. There is only one late second-hand source that names Esther as a wife of Joseph Smith, but it is an extremely reliable source. In a letter to Joseph F. Smith, dated 25th of June, 1888, Daniel H. Wells, as president of the newly opened Manti Temple, wrote on behalf of Albert Smith, who was requesting to be adopted into John Smith's family, and outlined Albert Smith's early history, mentioning his late wife Esther, who had died in 1856. He, Albert Smith, was also much afflicted with the loss of his first wife. It seems that she was sealed to Joseph the prophet in the days of Nauvoo, though she still remained his wife, and afterwards nearly broke his heart by telling him of it, and expressing her intention of adhering to that relationship. He, however, got to feeling better over it, and acting for Joseph, had her sealed to him in 1851, and to himself for time. Hales tries to justify his listing of Esther as definitely an eternity-only sealing by arguing that the phrase, though she remained Albert's wife, is consistent with an eternity-only sealing between Joseph Smith and Esther Dutcher, but it is also consistent with polyandry, as the case of Sylvia and Windsor Lyon demonstrated. Indeed, such an explanation would have been unnecessary if Wells would have simply mentioned that it was an eternity-only sealing, but he did not do that. Instead, he implied that she could have lived with either Albert or Joseph. Concerning this source, Quinn observed, Esther's intention of adhering to that relationship sounds like a reference to a sexual relationship that nearly broke her legal husband's heart while Joseph Smith was still alive. To me, it does not sound like adhering to a sealing for eternity, which the letter itself did not allege. At least, the former is one way to interpret the document's phrasing, a possibility for sexual polyandry that Hales doesn't admit. Hales responded, rather ironically, by saying that addressing every possible sexual polyandry reconstruction has never been my intent, especially those that require multiple assumptions accompanied by rather extreme explanations. Hales fails to appreciate that it was he who quoted the source as support for his eternity-only theory, and that Quinn only needs to show that the source is also consistent with sexual polyandry to overturn his use of it as evidence. Hales scoffs that Quinn detects sexuality where sexuality is not mentioned and some would say is not implied. He is entitled to his opinion, even one that is not based upon any obvious reference. But where is the obvious reference to eternity-only marriage? While Hales demands explicit evidence of sexuality, he seems oblivious to what that means for his interpretation. Indeed, there's no explicit mention of eternity-only marriage, not even a hint of it. Yet, he has presented it along with the case of Ruth Vos Serres as the best evidence that Joseph Smith married women for eternity only, which it most certainly is not. Hales argues that Wells would not have violated Victorian standards of the time by hinting at anything sexual. Indeed, references to sexuality would not usually have been intimated in official church correspondence. Therefore, he didn't imply anything sexual between Esther and the prophet. Hales' comment is highly ironic, since the church's publication of high-resolution scans of the original letter included a redacted or blacked-out section that can be read from the bleed-through on the back of the sheet, which is otherwise blank. The redacted text reads in part, "Now comes the saddest part of the story. It transpired that not long before her death, she committed adultery. The old gentleman is sadly grieved over this, and hopes that his and her daughter may be permitted to be baptized for her, and have her former charges considered as finished, as she was an erring though not a bad woman, and still be saved with Joseph as Joseph's wife." Obviously, Hales' argument doesn't hold water. While not explicit, there was nothing preventing Wells from implying a sexual relationship between Esther and Joseph Smith that broke Albert's heart in his official correspondence to Joseph F. Smith. Hence, while Hales classifies Esther Dutcher as definitely an eternity-only sealing, I list her as probably a time and eternity marriage with possible evidence for sexuality. Regardless, Esther Dutcher provides no evidence that Hales can use to establish eternity-only marriage among Joseph Smith's wives. As previously mentioned in the opening of this video, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner was persuaded to marry Joseph Smith in late February 1842, although she had been married to non-Mormon Adam Leitner for 7 years and was 8 months pregnant. Joseph Smith told Mary that she was given to him by revelation in 1834, and therefore she was his notwithstanding the civil marriage. Naturally, Hales is highly motivated to establish this polyandrous marriage as eternity only, since it is unlikely that Adam Leitner would be willing to discontinue having sex with his own wife. He quotes Mary Elizabeth's 1905 statement to an audience at Brigham Young University. "My husband did not belong to the church. I begged him and pled with him to join, but he would not. He said he did not believe in it. After he said this, I went forward and was sealed to Joseph for eternity." Hales interprets for eternity as eternity only, but acknowledges that on other occasions Mary Elizabeth stated that she had been sealed to the prophet for time and eternity, but tries to argue the reason for the dual reports may be due to the fact that she had experienced 2 sealing ceremonies. If the first sealing to Joseph Smith during his lifetime was for eternity only, and the second, a time and eternity proxy sealing performed on January 16, 1846, in the Nauvoo Temple, then both answers would have been accurate. However, Mary Elizabeth didn't say she was married to Joseph Smith for time and all eternity by proxy in the temple in 1846, but rather by Brigham Young in February 1842. Concerning the circumstances of her marriage to Smith, she said in a 1902 signed statement, "Brigham Young sealed me to him for time and all eternity, February 1842. Joseph said I was his before I came here. He said all the devils in hell should never get me from him. It is not likely that she would want to give the impression that she was married to Joseph Smith for time and all eternity if it weren't historically accurate. Indeed, that would be an impression she would want to avoid at all costs if it weren't true. A far more likely explanation for Lightner sometimes saying she was married to Joseph Smith for eternity is that she used eternity as shorthand for time and eternity. In her presentation at Brigham Young University in 1905, she remarked that she talked with him, Smith, for a long time and finally told him I would never be sealed to him until I had a witness. He promised that she would, but asked if she was going to be a traitor. To which Mary Elizabeth revealingly replied, I have never told a mortal, and shall never tell a mortal I had such a talk from a married man. This reaction seems extreme for a harmless, non-sexual, eternity-only sealing. Indeed, when others assumed her marriage to Smith included polyandrous sex, she not only said nothing to contradict it, but implied that it was true. In an 1892 letter to Apostle John Henry Smith, Mary Elizabeth expressed concern about rumors regarding her polyandrous relationship to Joseph Smith that had done her injury, and she wished to explain them, but only in person. If I could have an opportunity of conversing with you and Brother Joseph F. Smith, I could explain some things in regard to my living with Mr. Lightner after becoming the wife of another, which would throw light on what now seems mysterious, and you would be perfectly satisfied with me. I write this because I have heard that it had been commented on to my injury. I have done the best I could, and Joseph will sanction my action. I cannot explain things in this letter. Someday you will know all. That is, if I ever have an opportunity of conversing with either of you. Hales thinks the wording suggests the sealing performed while Joseph was alive was for eternity, because she continued to live with her legal husband, which would also be true of sexual polyandry. In fact, sexual polyandry seems implied by her unwillingness to put her thoughts in writing. She didn't even want to name the second husband. If it were merely an eternity-only sealing, she could have allayed John Henry's concerns by simply telling him. There would have been no reason to be guarded about an eternity-only sealing to Joseph Smith. Instead, she left him indefinitely suspended with thoughts about sexual polyandry. Hales further argues, Mary Elizabeth doesn't explain what information would make John Henry Smith perfectly satisfied regarding the apparent polyandrous arrangements. Yet, if she had reported having sexual relations with Joseph Smith and her legal husband during the same period, John Henry Smith would probably not have been perfectly satisfied. Obviously, Lightner didn't want to tell them she was married to Joseph Smith only for eternity, or else she would have simply stated it, and that would have been the end. What she had to explain was too sensitive to be put into writing. In person, she would have likely justified her actions by telling them about how Joseph used the story of an angel with a sword to convince her to marry him. She would have also probably told them what she told Emmeline B. Wells. I could tell you why I stayed with Mr. Lightner, things the leaders of the church does not know anything about. I did just as Joseph told me to do, as he knew what troubles I would have to contend with. This is probably what she meant in the letter to John Henry Smith when she said, Joseph will sanction my action. With this information, John Henry would have to be perfectly satisfied, for how could he oppose both his prophet and a sword-bearing angel? While Hales lists Lightner as definitely eternity only, I classify her as time and eternity with a strong possibility for sexual relations. On the 11th of December, 1841, Joseph Smith married Prescindia Huntington Buell, younger sister of Zina Huntington Jacobs. Hales is motivated to classify this as an eternity-only sealing by two factors. One, Prescindia's husband, Norman, was disaffected with the church and would not have been willing to discontinue having sex with his wife, while allowing Joseph Smith free access. And 2, Prescindia continued bearing Norman children prior to Smith's death, and that would be considered sexual polyandry if Smith were also having sex with her. Hales believes his classification of eternity only for Prescindia's marriage to Joseph Smith is supported by the 1883 statement of her younger brother, Oliver B. Huntington, where he said, "Dimmick had given our sisters Zina and Prescindia to Joseph as wives for eternity." Hales is well aware that this quote is ambiguous and presents it as an example of more nuanced evidence of eternity-only sealings. However, it is more likely that Oliver was contrasting Zina's and Prescindia's marriages to their legal husbands for time with their eternity marriages with Joseph Smith, which included time. In a previous video, I discussed the evidence that Zina's marriage to Joseph Smith was for time and eternity and included sexual relations. There is also similar evidence for Prescindia. Hales tries to dismiss an 1858 account by Mary Eddy Smith, who was the sister of Howard Corey, one of Joseph Smith's scribes in Nauvoo. I heard the latter woman, Prescindia, say afterwards in Utah that she did not know whether Mr. Buell or the prophet was the father of her son. Unfortunately, Joseph Smith's biographer, Fawn M. Brody, derailed discussion by focusing on Oliver Buell, Prescindia's sixth child born in Quincy, Illinois, on the 31st of January, 1840, which would date the conception to about 10th of May, 1839, 2.5 years before she was sealed to Joseph Smith. This caused Brody to veer off into speculation about an extramarital affair and the cause of Norman's disaffection with the church. However, the context of Mary Smith's account is after the birth of Oliver, when she and her husband were living in Lima, Illinois, situated about 30 miles south of Nauvoo. When Mary Eddy revisited the subject, she said, "Mrs. Buell is the woman whose husband lived in Lima, Illinois, when Joseph seduced her from him. Prescindia gave birth to 2 other sons after Oliver, Edwin in 1842, who probably died soon after birth, and John Hiram in 1843, who died 2 years later, both of whom were born in Lima, a detail that lends credibility to Mary Smith's account. Hales is skeptical since Joseph Smith was hiding from Missouri sheriffs, mostly at the home of James Taylor in Nauvoo, and there is no record of Prescindia making the 30-mile trip to Nauvoo around the 20th of October, 1842, an approximate conception date for John Hiram, which is probably asking too much of the historical record, and therefore not strong enough to support an argument from silence. The distance certainly didn't prevent her from being sealed to Joseph Smith in the first place. A sketch of Prescindia's life, published by Emmeline B. Wells in The Woman's Exponent in 1883, says that during the 5 or 6 years she lived in Lima, she made frequent journeys to Nauvoo and visited among the saints, being particularly acquainted with Joseph and Hiram. We know being away from Emma and hiding out from the law was no barrier to Joseph Smith's receiving visits from his other wives, as his letter summoning Sarah Ann Whitney and her parents to his hiding place outside Nauvoo demonstrates. In fact, it was probably a more opportune time. Hales also doubts Mary Eddy's account because there is no evidence of a close relationship between the 2 women, and such a disclosure violated the reticence about sexual matters that was standard for 19th century women. Typically, Hales demands specific evidence of sexuality, knowing that such evidence is rare, owing to the reluctance of Victorian Americans to discuss such matters. But when it is supplied, here by Mary Eddy Smith and elsewhere by Sarah Pratt, he uses that reticence to question the evidence, thus creating a closed system for evaluating evidence. However, if the 2 women were not on intimate terms, as Hales wants us to believe, how did Mary Eddy know Prescindia was married polyandrously to Joseph Smith? How did she know she was living in Lima at the possible time of her pregnancy by Smith? Such details were not public knowledge in 1858. A probable time for Mary Eddy's meeting Prescindia was during the winter of 1851 to 52. when she said she spent much of my time in Heber C. Kimball's home, where Pressendia would have been a frequent visitor. After Joseph Smith's death, Pressendia was sealed to Apostle Heber C. Kimball for time on the 4th of February, 1846, apparently without Norman's consent or knowledge, although she continued to live with Norman until May, at which time she left him and moved to Utah, where she later bore Kimball 2 children. Hales claims Pressendia did not live with Kimball's other wives during the early 1850s, so if Mary Eddy met her, it would probably have been as Pressendia was visiting Kimball's primary residence. Nevertheless, Mary Eddy had many opportunities over several months to meet Pressendia, as she claimed. Hales tries to cast doubt on Mary Eddy's account by pointing to the sometimes exaggerated and sensationalistic tone of the book, which was ghostwritten by Nelson Winch Green for a non-Mormon audience. It is a favorite tactic of Mormon apologists, but dismissing specific credible evidence based on the weaknesses of an entire source is not standard historical methodology, as a well-known book on historical method makes clear. For each particular of a document, the process of establishing credibility should be separately undertaken, regardless of the general credibility of the author. This is how the same Mormon apologists can quote Emma Smith's 1879 interview with Joseph Smith III for her testimony on the miraculous production of the Book of Mormon, although it includes her denial that her late husband lived polygamy. As I have discussed, Mary Eddy's claim about Pressendia is very credible. Indeed, to invent a false statement by Pressendia, as Hales seems to suggest, would require an intimate knowledge of her personal history, something he tries to deny was the case. I therefore classify Pressendia's marriage to Joseph Smith as a time and eternity sealing, with a very strong probability for sexual relations. In the second part of this video, I will examine the 6 women who Hales claims were probable eternity-only sealings. Because we know little more than she was sealed to Joseph Smith in 1842, I will skip Elizabeth Davis, and we have already discussed Zina Huntington in a previous video. Hales also cites an 1860 diary entry of Patty Bartlett Sessions for evidence of eternity-only marriage among Joseph Smith's polyandrous wives. Patty, who had been married to David Sessions since 1812, was sealed to Joseph Smith on the 9th of March, 1842, near the time her daughter Sylvia Lyon was also polyandrously sealed to Joseph Smith. In June 1860, she wrote a short sketch of her early life in the center pages of her diary, in which she said, "I was sealed to Joseph Smith by Willard Richards, March 9, 1842, in Newell K. Whitney's chamber in Nauvoo for eternity, and if I do not live to attend to it myself, when there is a place prepared, that is a temple or similar structure, I want someone to attend to it for me according to order. Sylvia, my daughter, was present when I was sealed to Joseph Smith." 7 years later, Patty inserted the words time and all eternity. When she informed Joseph F. Smith in June 1867 that I never was sealed at the altar in Nauvoo to anyone, she was sealed to Joseph Smith in the endowment house the following month, with Joseph F. Smith serving as proxy. About this time, she updated her journal by attaching a record of her 3rd of July 1867 sealing with sealing wax at the bottom of the page and inserting the words time and all eternity above the word eternity in her journal. She obviously did this to inform future readers that the work she requested had been done. The attached certificate verified that she had been sealed to Joseph Smith for time and all eternity. Hales argues that the word eternity in the original journal entry is similar to the language found in other eternity-only sealings, and that the inserted time and all eternity was added to match the wording of the 1867 certificate, which was the standard language of that time, and has no relevance to what was said in 1842. The problem with this assertion is that Hales cannot assume that for eternity means eternity only. When Hales argues that for eternity is similar to the language found in other eternity-only sealings, He has merely created an interpretive loop in which he cites other instances where he has imposed the same problematic definition or selectively interpreted the evidence. Remember, he has admitted that except for Ruth Vos Serres, clear statements that polyandrous sealings were performed only for eternity do not exist. Nevertheless, he attempts to uncritically interpret every instance of for eternity as meaning eternity only, which gets him into trouble when he tries to use Brigham Young's 1844 and 1845 journal for evidence. Young marked 5 entries with M.E. representing marriage for eternity, and one with M.T. representing marriage for time. Hales interpreted M.E. as marriage for eternity only. However, one M.E. is for Young's marriage on the 10th of September 1844 to Clarissa Ross, who had not been previously married and subsequently bore him 4 children. Obviously, to Young, marriage for eternity didn't mean for eternity only, although Hales mistakenly assumed it did. Even today, Mormons speak of going to the temple and being married for eternity when they mean for time and eternity. Elder Eldred G. Smith, for example, sermonized at the October 1948 church conference, "Teach your children that if they do not love enough to be married for eternity, they should not be married at all." It is therefore probable that Patty Sessions inserted the words time and all eternity into her journal to clarify what she had written. It makes no sense for her to insert the words into her historical narrative merely to make it match the wording of an 1867 temple ordinance. Indeed, it is not likely that she would have made the insertion if it were historically inaccurate, especially since it would imply a polyandrous marriage had taken place, which would have been considered scandalous according to Hales. Certainly, Patty would have taken care to avoid that impression, if it weren't true. In an email exchange with Hales, he responded to the above argument as follows: "I continue to disagree with your assessment of Patty Sessions' addition to her journal. Donna Toland Smart, Todd Compton, and Don Bradley disagree as well. Quinn even says it wasn't Patty, but the handwriting of someone else, which would leave the original statement, for eternity, strictly Patty's. This is completely wrong. Donna Toland Smart correctly states that both the diary and attached certificate are in Patty Sessions' handwriting. And Todd Compton notes that the ink in the certificate and interlinear insertions is identical and were probably all written in 1867. Quinn merely quotes Compton. By comparing the phrase time and all eternity in the certificate with the same phrase in the interlinear insertion, it can be easily seen that they are nearly identical. Note especially the formation of the terminal Y in eternity. Compare also the inserted eternity with the word eternity in the original journal entry. Patty didn't make an affidavit for Joseph F. Smith's affidavit books in 1869 or 70, but 2 years earlier, before the ordinance was performed, she prepared a statement about herself and other wives of Joseph Smith to help Joseph F. Smith. Her statement about herself, which appears at the end of the document, reads very similar to her journal, but fails to mention the kind of marriage. I was sealed to Joseph Smith the prophet by Willard Richards, March the 9th, 1842, in Nauvoo, in Newell K. Whitney's chamber. Sylvia, my daughter, was present. Then she added a postscript. Please let no one see this bottom part. Evidently, she was willing to affirm her sealing to Joseph Smith privately, but didn't want it known publicly, not the kind of behavior one would expect from an eternity-only sealing. While Hales lists Patty Bartlett Sessions as a probable eternity-only sealing, I have listed her as a time and eternity sealing with a strong possibility for sexuality. Because there are no records of Joseph Smith's being sealed to Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, either by Lucinda herself or witnesses, some have questioned whether she should be included. However, there is evidence from Sarah Pratt, Apostle Orson Pratt's wife, to whom Joseph Smith unsuccessfully proposed marriage. Since she understandably became a critic of Smith, Mormon apologists are reluctant to accept her testimony. However, I find her credible in this matter, especially since her claim is corroborated by Harriet Cook Young, who became Brigham Young's plural wife in 1843. Sarah Pratt reportedly said to Wilhelm Ritter von Wymetal, a German correspondent visiting Utah, who wrote under the pseudonym Wilhelm Weil, that after Joseph Smith had made his dastardly attempt on me, she confided her grief to an older neighbor, who happened to be Lucinda Harris. According to Pratt, Lucinda laughed and responded, "How foolish you are! I don't see anything horrible in it. Why, I am his mistress since 4 years." This 4-year reference likely points to the 2 months when the Smiths lived with the Harrises in far west Missouri, beginning on the 14th of March, 1838. Under this date, Joseph Smith's diary records, "We were immediately received under the hospitable roof of Brother George W. Harris, who treated us with all kindness possible. Here we refreshed ourselves with much satisfaction after our long and tedious journey." It seems Smith returned the favor by sleeping with Harris's wife. Use of the word mistress is probably Sarah's and implies sexual relations were involved. She likely chose the term because it was a spiritual marriage without a ceremony. Hales tries to class this marriage as a probable eternity-only sealing. But the concept of a special marriage sealing for eternity was non-existent in 1838, let alone the notion of an eternity-only sealing. Joseph Smith had taught that the marriage bond could survive the grave as early as 1835, but there was no discussion of the need for special authority to guarantee that blessing. Hence, there would be no theoretical basis for a discussion of eternity-only sealings in 1838. Because the year 1838 makes it difficult to categorize Lucinda's marriage to Smith as eternity only, Hales questions if it took place at all, but if it did, he prefers without evidence to date it to the Nauvoo time period. Yet, according to Andrew Jensen's notes, Harriet Cook Young is positive that she, Lucinda, was married to Joseph in Missouri. Consequently, Jensen included her in his list of 27 wives of Joseph Smith, published in the Historical Record in 1887, as one of the first women sealed to the prophet Joseph. This corroborates Sarah Pratt's account, making it difficult to ignore or dismiss. I therefore class Joseph Smith's marriage to Mrs. Harris as time only, or possibly time and eternity to reflect the belief that marriage could continue after death, with evidence of sexuality. Elvira Cowles lived with Joseph and Emma Smith in Nauvoo from 1840 until she was married to Jonathan Holmes on the 1st of December, 1842. 5 months later, she was sealed to 37-year-old Joseph Smith on the 1st of June, 1843. Late testimony from Elvira's daughter indicates that it was a time and eternity marriage that included sex. On the 9th of February, 1938, 88-year-old Phoebe Louisa Holmes Welling recalled, "I heard my mother testify that she was indeed the prophet's plural wife in life, and lived with him as such during his lifetime." Hales admits the phrase lived with him as a plural wife clearly suggested sexual activity, but questions the statement because it was made at least 60 years after Elvira had died in 1871. Instead, Hales wants to build an unlikely and speculative scenario based on another source, which is just as late, third-hand, and admittedly garbled. In May 1931, William Wright wrote a letter to the First Presidency in which he seems to describe Joseph Smith asking Jonathan Holmes to play a front husband role to Elvira, whom he mistakenly calls Lavina. "I was well acquainted with 2 of Joseph's wives, Lavina and Eliza. I came to Utah in 1869 and rented Lavina Holmes' farm. Before Joseph was shot, he asked Jonathan Holmes if he would marry and take care of Lavina." Hales thinks Wright was describing a situation very much like the case of Sarah Ann Whitney and Joseph Kingsbury, where Joseph Smith asked Kingsbury to marry and pretend to be Sarah Ann's husband, to shield him from suspicion and possible prosecution. However, in this case, the historical facts are exactly opposite from what happened with Kingsbury, with Holmes' marriage to Elvira preceding Smith's by 6 months. Consequently, Hales suggests Elvira misremembered the date of her sealing to Joseph Smith when she gave it to Joseph F. Smith in 1869, and that it may have actually occurred in 1842 before her marriage to Holmes, rather than in 1843. However, there is no reason to question the date other than Hales' need to justify Wright's account, which he acknowledges is very late, second-hand, and somewhat garbled. Indeed, priority should be given the 1843 date, since it comes from Elvira herself, and there can be no doubt she knew the date of her marriage to Holmes, which was the 1st of December 1842, and therefore she knew the date she gave Joseph F. Smith, the 1st of June 1843, came after her first marriage. So even if she got the date of her sealing to Smith wrong, she at least knew the correct sequence. It is therefore probable that Wright switched the order in his 50-plus-year-old memory because it didn't make sense to him that Joseph Smith would marry an already married woman. Hales points to the fact that Elvira didn't give birth to her first child until 19 months after Joseph Smith's death as evidence that Holmes was a front husband, but having no children by either man proves nothing. Although Hales maintains that it is impossible to conclusively determine what Elvira's marriage arrangements were, Hales categorizes Smith's marriage to her as a probable eternity-only sealing, with Jonathan as a possible front husband, and suggests that she did not have sex with either man until after Smith's death. However, this highly unlikely interpretation is the result of Hales' mishandling of the sources, giving priority to the wrong source, substituting his speculation for Elvira's date, and then imposing the atypical model of Sarah Ann Whitney and Joseph Kingsbury, which was the opposite of what happened to Elvira and Jonathan Holmes. The model best fitting their situation was that of Sylvia and Windsor Lyon. When priority is given to Elvira's date and to her daughter's testimony, then the case of Elvira and Jonathan Holmes must be taken as evidence for sexual polyandry. I therefore list Elvira Cowles Holmes as a probable time and eternity marriage, with evidence for sexuality. On the 2nd of December, 1841, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation concerning Apostle Orson Hyde's wife. "Let my handmaid, Nancy Miranda Hyde, hearken unto the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things, whatsoever he shall teach unto her, and it shall be a blessing upon her and upon her children after her, unto her justification, saith the Lord." Apparently, the teachings alluded to in the revelation included polyandrous marriage to Joseph Smith. According to her signed affidavit for Joseph F. Smith in 1869, Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde was sealed to Joseph Smith in May 1843. Hales classifies Miranda's marriage to Joseph Smith as a probable eternity-only sealing, with Orson acting as a possible front husband, and dismisses evidence to the contrary. William Arrowsmith, Apostle John Taylor's non-Mormon brother-in-law, living in Augusta, Lee County, Iowa in 1849, was interviewed by John Bowes, who reported that he said, he slept at his mother-in-law's, who was a Mormon, when Joseph Smith slept with Orson Hyde's wife under the same roof. Arrowsmith's mother-in-law, Agnes Taylor, lived outside Nauvoo, and Hales doubts that Joseph Smith had the ability to slip out of Nauvoo to spend an entire night with Miranda, although Smith was frequently hiding out from the law and traveling without Emma. Despite Hales' skepticism, there is nothing to either contradict or confirm Arrowsmith's allegation. While Hales classifies Miranda's marriage to Joseph Smith as a probable eternity-only sealing, with Orson acting as a possible front husband, I list Miranda as a probable time and eternity sealing, with evidence for sexuality. In Hales' last group of women, we have already discussed Sylvia Sessions and Sarah Ann Whitney. Mary Huron is conceded by Hales to be a time and eternity sealing, with a possibility for sexuality. Hence, he thinks it probable that her husband John Snyder became a front husband to prevent a sexual polyandry situation. There is no sealing date for when Mary became Joseph Smith's wife, and there is only one source for the allegation, but it comes from a devout Mormon with access to the information claimed. On the 2nd of September 1850, Joseph E. Johnson was tried by the High Council in Salt Lake City for committing adultery with one of Lorenzo Snow's wives, who got pregnant. During this trial, Johnson revealed that he had seen Joseph Smith doing a similar thing with his mother-in-law Mary Snyder, but said that he wasn't using it as an excuse for his own behavior. The brief minutes record, he was familiar with the first frigging, slang for sexual relations, that was done in his house with his mother-in-law by Joseph. Johnson had married Mary's oldest daughter, Harriet, on the 6th of October, 1840. Hales tries to create doubt by narrowing the window of opportunity, arguing that the house referred to by Johnson appears to have been built in 1843 in Ramus, Illinois. However, that might be a too literal reading of his house, as Johnson and his wife were living somewhere in Ramos about 3 years prior to building their own house. It would still be considered his house, whether he was a renter or an owner. As with the case of Sylvia Lyon, Hales discusses 4 possible interpretations, and then argues that the interpretation one chooses will be based on their willingness to accept and reject certain assumptions, and that without additional documentation, reliable conclusions are unattainable. On the contrary, one is definitely more probable than the others. The 4 interpretations, according to Hales, are: 1. Johnson lied or was inaccurately reported. 2. Joseph Smith committed adultery with Mary Huron. 3. Joseph Smith was sealed to Mary, and she had sex with him as well as her legal husband in a polyandrous relationship. And 4. Joseph Smith's time and eternity marriage to Mary voided her civil marriage to John, who was relegated to front husband status without sexual privileges, and therefore Mary experienced consecutive marriages rather than a polyandrous one. Hales dismisses the first 2, acknowledging that Joseph E. Johnson appears to be a trustworthy witness whose comments were probably quoted correctly by the secretary Joseph Kelly. And of course, he rejects the idea that a true prophet would commit adultery. However, of the 2 remaining interpretations, Hales mistakenly believes they are at least equally probable, and that he, as a faithful Mormon, is free to reject sexual polyandry and choose to believe that Joseph Smith's marriage to Mary voided her civil marriage to John. As previously discussed, this theory rests on faulty reasoning and implausible assumptions. Hales recognizes that his interpretation raises plausibility issues about John Snyder's willingness to give up his wife and to thereafter serve as a front husband. So, similar to what he did with Sylvia and Windsor Lyon, Hales asserts that John and Mary Snyder seem to have endured significant periods of estrangement after 1833, with no pregnancies after Mary turned 29. However, equating a lack of childbearing with marital problems is a stretch, especially when they remained together another 20 years. A more likely explanation is that Mary had become sterile in 1833 after giving birth to her last child, who did not live long. Hales has no evidence that the Snyders had a sexless marriage with significant periods of estrangement. Hales lists Mary Huron as a time and eternity marriage and John Snyder as a probable front husband. I also categorize Joseph Smith's marriage to Mary as time and eternity with evidence of sexuality. But I reject Hales' apologetically motivated speculation that John discontinued having sex with his wife and became a front husband, which is a hasty generalization based on one atypical marriage between Sarah Ann Whitney and Joseph Kingsbury. Contrary to Hales' assessment of the sources and conclusion that 12 of the 14 polyandrous marriages to Joseph Smith were probably eternity-only sealings, I think I have demonstrated that there is strong evidence that 13 were probably eternity-only marriages, and that many of them included evidence of sexuality. I have also demonstrated, with the possible exception of Ruth Vos Sayers, Hales virtually has no evidence for Joseph Smith's practice of eternity-only sealing. But even that evidence is highly doubtful. I have also demonstrated Hales' use of Doctrine and Covenants section 22, verse 1, does not support his interpretation that a time and eternity sealing voided a civil marriage and constituted a religious divorce. Nor can he use the pretend marriage of Sarah Ann Whitney and Joseph C. Kingsbury to justify his theory that whenever Joseph Smith had sex with another man's wife, that man discontinued having sex with his own wife and became a front husband. It should be clear that these are nothing but weak apologetic devices created to explain away evidence of sexual polyandry. Perhaps Hales should have heeded Richard Bushman's advice concerning polyandry. There is just seemingly no answer. How to explain it, I think, is very difficult, and probably you shouldn't even try. If you try to make up explanations, you get into more trouble. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for watching.